This is Sarah with Posh Pooch Designs, and today's video I'm going to show you how to make button molds. Now last week I showed you how to make some big buttons like this. Here's a dog bone and a tulip. We made these hearts and butterflies, and I showed you how to make those out of polymer clay. This week I'm going to show you how to take a favorite button and make a mold so you can make more buttons that are similar. Let me show you a couple that I did. I made this mold from this button, and we're going to make some of these today, and I'll show you how to do that. Here's another plain button mold that I made, and I made a couple of buttons from that mold. And so if you want to make a big button but say you only have one, you know, like this or this, let me grab it, then you can use your polymer clay and make molds so that you can make more big buttons. And also, if you have, say, some smaller buttons and you just love them, but you only have one, you can make some that are similar by making a mold. Here's a mold that I made with a dog bone from this button here, and then I used it to add to a round button, and I added a little gem. Another one I did is the dog paw button mold that I made from this little button, and then I used it to put on this button here. And you can take that tiny button and make it a button, or you can add it to another one. It's lots of fun. Here's the crown one that I did from this here, oops, that's sideways, button mold. And I did a duck one also. And I'm going to show you how to do this. It's really, really easy. All you need, of course, like I always say, is your parchment paper. And you're going to need some of your leftover pieces of polymer clay. It doesn't matter what color if we're just making the mold. Just what you have that's left over that you're not using, or just a color that's maybe not your favorite. You're also going to need some cornstarch. The cornstarch, we use a tiny bit of it to keep the clay from sticking to the button. And then when you use the mold, you use a teeny tiny bit to keep the clay from sticking in the mold. It just takes a tiny bit. Now you can also use talcum powder and a teeny tiny bit of powdered sugar. I prefer the cornstarch because it doesn't leave any residue and you can just brush off the powder. All right, as far as tools, I'm going to be using this to make sure if I have button holes when I do my buttons that the holes are nice, and I'll use this little knife tool to help me pop out the clay from the molds. But if you don't have these, you can use just a regular little plastic knife, and it's just to help ease it out. And you can also use a toothpick instead of my other tool if you need to fix button holes. So I wanted to let you know you could use those because it is good to have alternative tools if you don't want to go out and buy a bunch of tools and you're just trying to learn some stuff. The other thing you're going to need is an oven. And you can see back here, I have my big oven and my small oven. For today's project, I am going to be using my small oven, and you do need to set your oven, whether it's the big one or the small one, to 275 degrees. We are going to be baking our molds at 275 for 15 minutes. So you need to preheat your oven ahead of time. So why don't you go ahead and do that, and I'll start getting my parchment paper out. The first thing that you need to do before you begin is to put a piece of parchment paper in the bottom of the pan that you're going to be working in. And that's just to keep the residue from the clay from getting on the pan itself. Also, this keeps it from sticking. We're going to do that, and then the next thing that you need to do is put a piece of parchment paper out on your work surface. And again, this is to keep the clay from getting on your counter or wherever you're working. If you don't have a lot of parchment paper, you can use wax paper for this part of it, but you do need to use parchment paper in your pan. All right, the next thing you need to do is pick your button or your thing that you're going to be making a mold for. And I'm going to be making a mold for this little button. So the next thing is to choose my clay. So I'm just going to grab this little ball of purple right here. It looks like it's got a little green on it. I'll pull that off. And before I begin working with my clay, I need to make sure that my hands are clean. So I'm going to wash my hands, and I always use just a tiny dab of Dawn dishwashing soap tiny little dab. I wash my hands really good, rinse my hands really good, and dry them really good. That way, whatever residue or oils that are on your hands doesn't get in the clay. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is begin to knead up our clay. So we're going to squeeze it and knead it until it's really, really soft. Because it needs to be very pliable if we're going to make a mold. I would say spend about 2, maybe 3 minutes just kneading and pushing, you know, stretching it out. You hear that bubble? Want to get all the bubbles out. Make sure it's nice and soft. My clay is nice and soft, and so I'm going to roll it in a ball. And I sort of set it over it to see if it's going to be wide enough. And I sort of just press it down just a little because I want to make sure I'm going to cover all of my button. That needs to be a little wider, so I'm just going to press with my hand and see that it's going to fit. Then I'm going to take just a teeny tiny bit of my cornstarch and just tap it on there like that. And just use my finger and spread it out. And this is going to keep the button from sticking to the clay. All right, then we'll just take our button, turn it in, and just push it down. And you want to make it a little deeper than what the button actually is. And I kind of push up on the sides. Make sure we're getting the whole shape. And then we're going to take a tool. You can use this knife, pull that off. See, I'm sort of just pulling it back just a little. And if the button will come out, let it. If not, just take your little knife and just kind of gently, there we go, bring it out. And see, there's the button mold. And once we bake it, we can dust off all this powder. It's not going to matter a bit. So let's go ahead and bake it at 275 for 15 minutes. So while the flower button mold is baking, I thought I'd go ahead and show you how to make a button from a button mold. And here's a button mold that I made the other day. It's just a basic button. So we need to put a little cornstarch in there. Grab just a teeny tiny bit. Shake it around, make sure everything's covered. Move that over. All right. So here's our button mold. It has a little bit of cornstarch in it, and I chose some clay here. It's got some pink and green, and I've been kneading on it a little bit just to get it soft. And so what we're going to do, it's nice and soft, roll it in a ball. I always find it's easier if I roll it in a ball. And we want to try to get it to fit, so we're going to smash it out a little like we did with the palm of our hand. All right, that looks like that's going to fit. So we just take our button mold. This is actually a little too big, so I'm going to roll it again. Make sure it's nice and squished up. All right, let's try it again. Not flatten it quite so much. There we go. Now, I've got my button mold. I'm going to take this clay and gently push it in there. All right, now I'm going to gently peel the sides, and you can see the button. And so I'm going to take my knife and I'm just going to cut around those edges. There we go. Just to get off all the excess clay. Okay, I'll just take my finger and gently push those edges in. you can kind of roll the edge to kind of get it to go under. And I think that looks pretty nice. Ready for baking. I like that purple and green together too. So when our flower button's done, we can bake this one. Don't forget, before you put it in the oven to bake, make sure you've gone in and made sure those little holes go all the way through your button. If you don't, you won't be able to sew it onto anything. And you can use this tool, or you can just use a toothpick just to make sure that your buttons go all the way through. Let's check and see if our button mold is ready. Here's our button mold that we made from our flower. And I suggest after it cools, you just take a cheap little paintbrush and just dust off that powder as best that you can. And be sure and let your mold rest or cure for 24 hours before you start making buttons with it. If not, it won't set real good. But that's how you make a button mold. So we'll let this one cool and rest, and then we'll check on the button that we made from our round button mold, see if it's ready. So here's our button, fresh out of the oven. It's nice and hot, and we can't touch it or glaze it or anything until it cools. And be sure to let your button rest for about 24 hours. And here's the mold that we used. I think it turned out really pretty. Let me put my hot mitt back on and move that out of the way. All right. So today we learned how to make a button mold from a button. And then we learned how to make a button from a button mold. So that's a lot of fun. Now don't get frustrated if it doesn't work the first couple times that you do it. Practice, practice, practice. The key to making good buttons and good button molds is the cornstarch so that it doesn't stick. And again, just go ahead and brush off with an old paintbrush or even an old makeup brush that maybe you're not using, and just get those powder out of there. But of course you want it there when you make your button so it doesn't stick. So I hope that was fun and that you'll make some of those. Now next week on Monday, I'm going to show you how to make some dog tags. And these are some that I just whipped up. And I'm going to show you how to make them, how to be able to put their name on them, and what you're going to need for the dogs to wear them, or even for you. They make great jewelry as well. So I'm going to pick out some new cutters and see what we can come up with. So that'll be a lot of fun. So next week, dog tags.